Let us step quietly into the world of the Vikings, not through their longships or their battles, not through their roaring feasts and dangerous raids, but instead through the more curious and perhaps less celebrated paths of their laws. The Vikings, as we imagine them, often appear in our minds as unruly seafarers, warriors with wild beards and horned helmets, though, of course, the horns were a later invention. But beneath the roar of the sea and the clash of the sword lay something much quieter, something far stranger, and yet deeply woven into the life of these northern peoples: their laws. These laws, at once harsh and curious, strange and deeply human, reveal an unexpected dimension of Viking life. For while they lived in a world of ice, fjords, and far-sailing adventures, they were also a people who needed order, stability, and some manner of justice. Without rules, their world would have fractured. So the Norse devised laws that to us may seem odd, almost alien, and yet to them were the backbone of their society. The first thing to understand is that Viking laws were not written down in the early centuries. They were preserved in memory, held by men known as lawspeakers, who carried in their minds the rules of society as carefully as a bard would carry the verses of a poem. In Iceland, for instance, one such lawspeaker was tasked to recite a portion of the laws at the great assembly known as the Althing. He would stand before the people and speak aloud, making sure that everyone knew what was permitted, what was forbidden, and what would be punished. Imagine, for a moment, a society where laws were not read but spoken, sung almost like an incantation, floating through the open air. But it is when we look at the details of these laws that the strangeness begins to appear. For example, let us take the idea of outlawry. In the Viking world, to be outlawed was perhaps the harshest fate of all. If a man committed a serious crime, say a killing or a grave insult, and failed to make amends, he could be declared an outlaw. This did not simply mean exile in the way we might think of it. Outlawry meant that the person no longer had the protection of society. Anyone could harm him, even kill him, and face no punishment for it. The outlaw became a ghost while still alive, stripped of kin, stripped of law, stripped of name. He might survive in the wilderness, perhaps, but he would do so as less than a man. And yet, the Viking law did not stop there. There were two kinds of outlawry: full and lesser. Full outlawry meant that the person was cast out forever, until death claimed him. Lesser outlawry, however, was temporary, 3 years in length. During this time, the man was expected to wander, to suffer, to reflect. If he survived and returned after those 3 years, he might be welcomed back into society, though not without scars upon his reputation. The idea is at once brutal and strangely merciful, for it offered both punishment and the chance. The world of the Vikings, when viewed through the lens of their laws, seems less like a tale of constant violence and more like a tapestry stitched with threads of order, ritual, and curious customs. If one listens carefully, behind the clang of sword and shield, behind the roar of storms upon the northern seas, there is another rhythm, quieter but no less important, the rhythm of rules, obligations, and the strange sense of justice that shaped their daily lives. Let us continue wandering through this world, where law was as sacred as the gods, and where breaking it meant more than punishment. It meant dishonor, exile, or even erasure. To begin, consider the law of inheritance, which reveals much about Viking priorities. When a man died, his possessions, land, livestock, weapons, even slaves, had to be divided among his heirs. The laws carefully listed who had the right to what. Sons were the primary heirs, but daughters could also inherit if there were no sons. Yet, curiously, weapons and farm tools often went first to the male heirs, while daughters received movable wealth like silver, jewelry, or livestock. This division reflected both practicality and symbolism. Men continued the warrior-farmer role, while women maintained the household's prosperity. But the laws went further still. If no close relatives existed, inheritance might stretch outward to cousins, or even more distant kin. A man's wealth was never left unclaimed. It flowed through the veins of kinship, binding family lines together across generations. Stranger still were the rules concerning fosterage. Among the Vikings, it was common for children to be sent to be raised by another family, not because their parents could not care for them, but because fostering created bonds of loyalty and obligation between households. The law upheld these relationships with surprising seriousness. A foster father, though not biologically tied, often had duties nearly equal to a parent. To insult a man's foster child was as grave as insulting his blood. And in some sagas, foster brothers swore loyalty so fierce that to betray one was unthinkable. Imagine a world where the lines of family stretched not just by birth, but by law, into chosen alliances sealed through the raising of children. The laws also dictated the rights of thralls, slaves in Viking society. Thralls could be bought, sold, and inherited, yet they were not entirely beyond the reach of law. Killing another man's thrall required compensation, for though the thrall was not free, he was considered property of value. Oddly enough, thralls could sometimes purchase their own freedom or be granted it by their masters. Once freed, they and their descendants could, over time, become respected members of society. The law, in its strange way, offered even the lowest a potential path upward, though it was a long and uncertain climb. Consider, too, the laws surrounding the thing, the assembly. Attendance was not optional. Every free man was required. If we keep walking quietly through the winding path of Viking laws, we soon realize that what seems at first glance harsh and unforgiving was, in its own way, a deeply structured attempt to keep life from descending into chaos. For the Norse lived in a world where winter could starve a family, where feuds could consume entire clans, where the sea itself could swallow lives without warning. In such a place, order, however strange it might appear to us, was sacred. One of the most fascinating aspects of these laws was how they regulated feuds, for feud was both expected and feared. In many societies, vengeance is something the law seeks to extinguish, but in the Viking Age, vengeance was something the law sought to manage. Imagine a man slain in a quarrel. His brothers, his cousins, even his distant kin were expected to demand redress. Yet the law offered a strange balance. They could demand blood or they could accept silver. This silver, the wergild, was not just a random sum. It was carefully measured. The death of a chieftain required a far greater payment than that of a simple farmer. Even the death of a thrall, a slave, required some compensation, though far less. Human life, in the Viking view, was weighed in metal. Cold, perhaps, but also practical. By transforming vengeance into silver, the law gave families a way to step away from endless killing. Sometimes, however, silver was not enough. The sagas are filled with cases where families rejected payment and demanded blood. In Njál's saga, one of the great Icelandic stories of law and feud, the cycle of vengeance spirals so out of control that it leads to tragedy after tragedy. Yet even here, the law hovers in the background. Assemblies are called, cases are argued, compromises are sought. Again and again, we see how the Norse tried to weave law into the fabric of even their darkest conflicts. But law was not only about murder and vengeance. It reached into the small details of daily life. Consider the matter of insults. To us, an insult may sting, but it rarely enters a courtroom. To the Vikings, however, an insult could ignite feuds as deadly as any blade. The law therefore treated insults with surprising seriousness. Words questioning a man's bravery, honor, or sexual role could be considered nearly as damaging as physical harm. One could be fined or challenged to a duel for such accusations. This shows us a society where reputation was life itself. A man without honor was a man already half dead. And then there was the law of the household, a world unto itself. Within the farmstead, the authority of the master was strong, yet even here rules applied. Husbands and wives had obligations to each other, and children had rights in inheritance. A woman, as we mentioned earlier, could demand divorce for mistreatment. What makes this especially striking is that the law recognized her word publicly. She needed witnesses, yes, but her declaration carried weight. This was no small thing in an age. When we left our wandering path through Viking law, we had reached the edge of outlawry, that terrible sentence which stripped a man of every protection. Let us step further into that lonely landscape and see what it truly meant. To be outlawed was not simply to be cast away. It was to become less than human in the eyes of the law. For a full outlaw there was no return, no redemption. He could not be given food, shelter, or assistance by anyone. If he entered a farmstead, those who harbored him risked their own punishment. A man who was outlawed was said to be wolfed. That is, he was placed outside the circle of mankind, free to be hunted like an animal. To see an outlaw on the road was to see prey. And yet, strangely, some outlaws became figures of legend. Grettir the Strong, one of the great saga heroes, lived nearly 20 years as an outlaw. Hunted, betrayed, forced to hide in caves and remote valleys, he survived by cunning and strength. Though the law had erased him, memory and story kept him alive. In such tales we glimpse the paradox. A society that demanded order, yet also admired those who could defy it. But outlawry was not always permanent. The lesser outlawry, lasting 3 years, was intended almost as a test. Could a man survive alone, outside society's protection? If so, perhaps he could be welcomed back, scarred but wiser. We might think of it as a strange Viking version of exile mixed with probation, a punishment that was also a chance for redemption. Beyond outlawry lay the intricate rituals of oath and testimony. For in a world without paper or printing, truth rested on the spoken word. The oaths were not lightly given. When a man swore in court, he did so upon sacred objects, a silver ring, a sword, or even upon the very altar stones of a temple. Breaking such an oath was not only a crime against men, but against the gods. One who swore falsely risked not just legal punishment, but divine wrath. Imagine standing before your kin, your neighbors, your rivals, placing your hand upon a ring said to hold the spirit of Thor or Odin, and declaring your truth. The weight of that moment was enormous. At the Althing in Iceland, oaths and testimony often became the battlefield. Witnesses were called, each side producing men to swear what they had seen or heard. Yet it was not always about the facts as we imagine them today. Instead, it was about procedure, about whether the right number of witnesses had been called, whether the oaths had been spoken in the proper form. A clever lawyer could win a case not by disproving his opponent, but by catching him in a flaw of ritual. This may seem strange to us, but it shows how deeply the Vikings believed in the power of form and order. In Njal's saga, perhaps the greatest story of law in the Viking world, we see this vividly. Njal himself, a wise and peaceful man, was a master of the law. Again and again, he guided others through disputes, finding settlements, spotting errors, preventing. When we continue wandering into the strange and layered world of Viking law, we find ourselves confronted again and again with the same truth. The people of the North did not see laws as something distant or abstract. They saw them as living rules, woven into the fabric of their daily lives, heavy with ritual, and binding upon not just the individual, but entire families, even whole generations. One of the most curious aspects of Viking law was the great seriousness with which oaths were treated. Today we speak promises casually, and contracts are signed with pen and paper. But for the Vikings, a man's word was not simply a personal declaration. It was a sacred commitment, binding in the eyes of gods, men, and memory itself. To break one's oath was not merely dishonorable. It was to invite ruin upon yourself, and in some cases upon your kin. Oath-swearing ceremonies were formal occasions. In many gatherings, men would place their hands on a silver ring, often kept by the local chieftain, or sometimes stored in the temple of a god. The ring was not an ordinary ornament, but a sacred object, infused with the weight of divine witness. By touching it, and by speaking the oath aloud, the man declared that every word spoken was true, and that he pledged himself fully to whatever bond he entered. The penalties for breaking such an oath could be harsh. At the very least, the man would lose credibility and respect within his community. No one wished to trade with a man whose promises were unreliable, nor to fight beside a warrior who might falter at a crucial moment. More severely, a man who broke an oath could be fined, punished, or even declared an outlaw, driven into the wilderness without the protection of law. This intertwining of honesty, religion, and survival shaped the way Viking society functioned. The world in which they lived was often harsh and unforgiving. Trust was not a luxury, it was a necessity. If a man swore to lend his neighbor a cow through the winter, the survival of that neighbor's family might depend upon it. If a warrior promised loyalty to his chieftain in battle, the stability of the entire war band rested upon that word. The oaths were not always spoken only between men. Women, too, could swear binding oaths, and though their role in society was different, their word carried weight. A woman might swear to remain faithful in marriage, or she might swear an oath of property ownership, or even one of vengeance if wronged. The law allowed her to do so, and though she could not always enforce every aspect of her claim without male witnesses, the community still respected the formality of her sworn word. Beyond oaths, there lay the world of punishments, a landscape of both practical necessity and ritual symbolism. Viking punishments were not always consistent, nor always violent. Much depended on the crime and on the influence of the person accused. But the logic of Viking law almost always followed a principle of balance. If one were to follow a Viking not into the courtroom or the sacred grove but down to the long shoreline, one would discover yet another dimension of their laws. The world of the Vikings was bound not only by the rules of kinship, oath, and sacrifice, but also by the Great Sea. For them, the ocean was not only a road but a judge. It was a place that gave fortune and took life. And so, naturally, it had its own laws. The Viking Age was, above all, the age of movement. Their longships cut across fjords, rivers, and vast seas, reaching markets as far as Constantinople and Baghdad. Yet these voyages, though celebrated in sagas as heroic adventures, were not reckless expeditions. They were tightly governed by maritime codes, codes unwritten perhaps, yet deeply respected. At the heart of Viking seafaring was the ship itself. A longship was not merely a vessel. It was a community, a floating village, and a sacred space. When men set out together across the water, they formed a temporary society, and like any society, it required rules. Disputes could not be allowed to erupt unchecked on board, for the slightest disorder could doom the entire crew. The law of the ship began even before the keel touched the water. Ownership was carefully defined. Ships were expensive, requiring months of skilled labor and vast amounts of timber. Sometimes a single chieftain commissioned a ship, claiming it as his own property. But more often, groups of men pooled resources, forming partnerships not unlike modern companies. Each man's share was recorded and remembered. Should a ship be sold or spoils taken from a raid, profits had to be divided according to these agreed shares. Failing to respect this principle was considered theft, not just from individuals but from the entire brotherhood of the voyage. Once the ship left the shore, its law was absolute. The helmsman, usually appointed by common consent, acted as the highest authority on board. He was responsible for steering the vessel not only in the physical sense but also in judgment. If quarrels arose between men, the helmsman settled them. His word was binding until landfall, when disputes could be revisited before the thing. To defy the helmsman at sea was among the gravest of crimes, for it risked the lives of all. Seating itself reflected hierarchy and law. Men did not simply sprawl wherever they pleased. Every oarsman had an assigned bench, tied directly to his share of the ship and his contribution to the voyage. To move without permission, to seize another man's place, was not only disrespectful but a legal breach. It upset the balance of the community. The benches, in effect, were contracts carved into wood. Discipline extended also to provisions. Food and drink were stored in communal supplies, rationed fairly according to the voyage's length and the dangers ahead. A man caught hoarding food for himself or drinking more than his portion faced punishment ranging from fines to expulsion from the crew. The flicker of torchlight still lingers in our mind from the last gathering, the smoky hall where oaths were sworn and disputes judged. Yet the world of Viking law was vast, and every season brought new rules, new cases, and fresh interpretations of what was right and what was forbidden. If we walk further into this strange world, we discover more laws that at first seem peculiar, yet reveal the deeper fabric of Viking society. One law that often surprises us concerns hospitality. In the Viking Age, hospitality was not merely a polite gesture but a sacred duty. A traveler arriving at your door could not be turned away, even if he was a stranger or worse, someone of doubtful reputation. To deny shelter and food was to commit an offense against both custom and the gods. Guests had to be fed and given a place by the fire before questions were even asked. Only once food and drink had been shared could a host ask about the traveler's name, business, or origin. The laws made it clear. Even enemies could not be refused basic hospitality, at least for one night. If one ignored this rule, the shame would be heavy, and the penalty could be severe. Connected to this was another strange custom. Gifts were almost mandatory. A guest was expected to bring something for the host, even if small, and the host was expected to give something in return. Viking law was not written in books but lived through such customs, binding people together with invisible threads of obligation. To refuse a gift, or to fail to give one back, was considered not only rude but unlawful in spirit, breaking the harmony of society. Yet the same society that valued generosity had strict boundaries when it came to theft. Stealing food, livestock, or tools could condemn a man to outlawry, even if the theft was small. Imagine taking a neighbor's sheep because your family was starving. By the strict code of the Vikings, that single act could mark you as a criminal with no protection. Such harshness may appear strange, but it reveals how fragile survival was in the North. Every sheep, every cow, every tool meant life or death in a hard winter. To steal was to threaten not only one man but his entire household. Even stranger were the laws regarding insults. In our world, an insult may sting, but in Viking society, words had weight heavy as stone. To call a man arger, a term implying effeminacy, cowardice, or perversion, was not only an insult but a legal offense. Such words demanded a duel or compensation. If a man failed to defend his honor, his reputation and standing in society would collapse. The law recognized that words could destroy as surely as blades, and so they were treated with utmost seriousness. But not all words were forbidden. At the Althing, the great assembly, debate was fierce and voices loud. Men argued cases passionately, reciting long lines of memory and poetry. The lawspeaker, who knew the laws by heart, would recite them aloud year after year so that all could hear in. When one thinks of the Vikings, visions of raiding ships, flashing steel, and smoke rising from distant villages often come to mind. Yet, beneath that familiar image lies a world of laws, customs, and expectations that guided not only the battlefield but the quiet halls of their homes. In this chapter, let us step away from the courts and trials, and instead walk softly into the world of Viking feasts, hospitality, oaths, and the countless everyday laws that shaped how people behaved toward one another. These were laws no less important than those decided at the great assemblies, for they defined the rhythm of life itself. Imagine, for a moment, a longhouse on a winter's night. Snow presses heavily against the roof, winds howl outside, but within there is warmth. The hearth burns, benches line the walls, and the smell of roasted meat fills the smoky air. The people gathered here do not see their actions merely as food and drink, but as an important observance of custom. To share a meal in Viking society was to bind yourself to another in friendship, loyalty, and mutual protection. But even here, there were laws about how one ought to behave, what must be offered, and what insults must never be given. One of the most sacred obligations was the duty of hospitality. A traveler arriving at your door could not be turned away lightly. To refuse food or shelter was to shame not only yourself but your entire household. In a cold land, where hunger and frost could kill within a single night, hospitality was more than kindness. It was survival. There were laws, unwritten yet unbreakable, that a host must give bread, meat, and a place by the fire, and in return the guest was expected to behave with honor, to respect the household, and to leave when their welcome was done. But not all guests were good ones. There are sagas that tell of travelers who stayed too long, drank too much, or insulted their host. In those cases, the law turned swiftly. A guest who abused hospitality was seen as worse than an enemy, for they had broken the trust of the hearth. Insults at a feast could easily spiral into blood feuds, and so laws existed to keep peace in such moments. One law that might surprise us today was the seriousness with which words themselves were judged. In Viking culture, to call a man coward or to question his honor was not a light jest. It was an injury as real as striking him with a sword. Such an insult could be grounds for a legal case, and in some sagas we see entire lawsuits launched over a careless word. This was not because the Vikings were overly sensitive, but because honor was the foundation of their social order. A man's reputation could decide whether others would follow him into battle, trade with him across the seas, or give their daughter in marriage. To tarnish that with a single word was to strike at the very core of his worth. To protect this, the law offered paths for redress. One could demand compensation just as one might FO. In the quiet glow of firelight, when the winds whispered across the fjords and the smoke of the hearth rose slowly into the rafters of a Viking longhouse, there was another presence that haunted the minds of men and women alike: the power of magic. To the Norse people, the world was more than the physical stones beneath their feet and the sharpness of an iron blade. It was also a place where unseen forces walked among them, where fate was woven by invisible hands, and where the strange arts of sorcery and prophecy could shape the course of a man's life. Yet, as much as these powers were both feared and respected, the Vikings had laws about them. Laws that decided who could practice such things, who could not, and what punishments awaited those who crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable. To understand these laws is to step into one of the strangest and most unsettling corners of Viking society, a place where fear of the unseen mingled with very real consequences in court. The Vikings called this art seer, a form of magic often associated with prophecy, illusion, and the weaving of fate itself. Unlike the loud clashing of swords or the solemn weight of silver arm rings, seer was subtle, hidden, and mysterious. It was the art of bending the will of others, foretelling what was to come, or calling upon spirits to act in the world of men. But here lies the strange paradox. While seer was seen as powerful and sometimes necessary, it was also regarded with deep suspicion. The laws of the Northlands treated it differently depending on who practiced it. Women, for instance, were allowed, at least tolerated, in the role of vulvas, seeresses who traveled from settlement to settlement, offering visions of the future. A community might call upon such a woman during times of famine, war, or uncertainty. Her words, spoken in a trance, were often considered the voice of the Norns themselves, the weavers of destiny. But if a man practiced seer, it was an entirely different matter. The laws declared it to be shameful, even unmanly. To accuse a man of sorcery was not merely to accuse him of meddling with powers forbidden. It was to strip him of his honor. A man convicted of practicing seer might face exile or outlawry, the ultimate punishment short of death itself. The reason was deeply tied to Viking ideas of masculinity. Seer required submission, channeling forces rather than conquering them, weaving rather than striking. To the Viking mind, it was considered womanly, and thus dishonorable for a man. The sagas tell us of such cases. In the saga of Eiríkur the Red, we hear of seeresses invited to predict the outcome of hardships. Villagers gave them food, gifts, and respect, and no shame was attached to the practice. Yet, in the Ynglinga saga, men accused of sorcery were despised, cast out, or killed. Such contradictions created a strange tension. Magic was real, useful, and powerful, but it was also dangerous, shameful, and restricted. The laws themselves. Let us drift deeper into the strange world of Viking law, where society balanced itself on customs that may seem harsh to us today but were, in their own way, designed to keep order in a turbulent age. Among the most striking and curious of these laws was the practice of outlawry, an ancient punishment that stripped a person of all legal protection, casting them out of their community and, in a sense, out of humanity itself. To be declared an outlaw in Viking times was more than simply being exiled or shunned. It was to become a ghost who still breathed, a man or woman alive in the flesh but already dead in the eyes of the law. If you were outlawed, you no longer had rights, you no longer had kinship ties that could protect you, and anyone, friend or foe, could harm you without consequence. Outlawry was the Viking answer to the problem of maintaining peace in a society that was otherwise saturated with the spirit of feuds, blood debts, and vengeance. The Viking world was not one of prisons or long incarcerations. Justice was not served through confinement but through fines, compensation, or, in extreme cases, banishment. This system relied heavily on the thing, the great assembly where laws were recited and judgments passed. Here, cases of theft, insult, violence, and betrayal were heard, and it was here that outlawry could be pronounced. There were two main forms of this punishment: The first was called lesser outlawry, which lasted for 3 years. A man condemned in this way had to leave his home, his farm, his ship, and his family behind. For 3 years he was expected to live beyond the bounds of society, often in the wilderness or on foreign soil. After this period, if he survived, he might return and reclaim his place. But survival was never guaranteed. The wild landscapes of the north, filled with cold winters, hungry wolves, and rival raiders, were not kind to those without support. The second and far more dreadful form was full outlawry. This was, in essence, a civil death. To be sentenced to full outlawry was to be erased from society for life. You could not return. You could not seek protection from the law. You could not even rely on your kin to shelter you, for they risked punishment themselves if they aided you. You were branded forever as an outsider. If anyone killed you, they would not be punished. If anyone took your property, they would not owe compensation. You existed, but only as a shadow on the edge of the world. Imagine what it would feel like to live under such a sentence. To walk away from the thing with the knowledge that you no longer belonged to the community that had raised you, fed you, and given you a name. To watch the faces of your kin turn away, not out of cruelty, but out of the necessity of survival, for to aid you was to share your fate. A lesser outlaw might dream of returning after 3 years, but a full outlaw had nothing left to hope for but survival on the edge of the earth. Some outlaws wandered. When we think of the Vikings, it is tempting to picture only warriors with swords and shields, storming across the seas, raiding monasteries, or charging into battle. Yet, like any society, their daily lives were woven together by laws, customs, and traditions that governed even the most intimate of matters: marriage, family, and the household. The Vikings, though fierce and often violent in their exploits abroad, had an intricate and surprisingly detailed set of rules for how men and women could marry, separate, and manage their families. These laws reveal a society that valued property, alliances, and honor above almost anything else. To understand Viking marriage laws, we must first imagine the society in which they lived. These were farming communities, scattered across fjords, valleys, and coastal settlements. Land was wealth. Cattle were wealth. Even slaves were considered wealth. Marriage, therefore, was not simply a matter of love, companionship, or desire. It was above all else a legal and economic agreement. A union between a man and a woman was also a union between two families, and it carried obligations, negotiations, and protections. The beginning of a Viking marriage often started with betrothal. It was not the bride and groom who arranged such matters, at least not formally, but their families. The father, or sometimes the closest male relative, would negotiate with the suitor's family. Bride price and dowry were central to this exchange. The bride price, or munder, was the amount of silver, goods, or sometimes land that the groom's family paid to the bride's family. This was not a purchase in the way we might misunderstand it today, but rather a guarantee of the man's ability to support a wife and a household. The dowry, on the other hand, was property given by the bride's family to the bride herself, though managed by her husband. It might include livestock, household tools, or even slaves. These legal safeguards ensured that if a marriage ended either through death or divorce, the woman had some property to rely on. In this way, the Vikings created a legal framework to protect women's rights to some degree, though always within the patriarchal bounds of their world. Wedding ceremonies themselves were also deeply symbolic and bound by custom. A feast was held, with plenty of ale and mead, and offerings were made to the gods. Thor's hammer was sometimes placed on the bride's lap to symbolize fertility. The union was considered not only a contract between families but also a sacred bond overseen by divine forces. Breaking such a contract carried both legal and spiritual consequences. Once married, Viking law gave husbands significant authority, but wives were far from powerless. A woman in Viking society could manage the household, oversee slaves, and control food and resources. She held the keys to the family's strongbox, quite literally. These keys were often worn on her belt as a sign of her authority within the home. In T. The fire in the longhouse has burned low, and the air is filled with the gentle crackling of the embers. Imagine yourself once more among the Vikings, where laws were not only about violence, honor, or punishment, but also about the quieter, steadier rhythms of life, laws that governed inheritance, land, property, and the exchange of goods. These were not the dramatic duels or outlawry sentences that stirred sagas, but they were the foundations of everyday survival. For without rules of inheritance, families would quarrel endlessly over who received what after a death. Without rules of trade, the balance of exchange could collapse, leaving some cheated and others resentful. And so, the Vikings, practical as always, crafted laws to govern these matters, binding their communities together not only in blood, but in custom and shared obligation. Let us wander together, slowly, through these laws of wealth and legacy. Imagine we are seated again at the Thing, the open-air assembly where judgments were spoken aloud, where every farmer and trader leaned on his staff to listen. The mountains rise in the distance, the wind carries the smell of salt from the fjord, and the words of the lawspeaker rise above the murmur of the crowd. He does not speak quickly. He recites carefully, repeating when needed, for the law must be memorized and carried in the minds of men. Each word he says binds the present to the past. The first matter he addresses is inheritance. In Viking society, the death of a man was not only a sorrow for his family but also a serious question of property. Who would hold the land? Who would take control of the cattle, the ships, the weapons, the precious silver? These things could not be left without clear ownership, for property disputes could easily turn into feuds. So, the laws laid down a firm pattern of inheritance. Sons, above all, were favored. The eldest son often took the main share, though not always all, for fairness among brothers was valued. Daughters, too, had rights, though more limited than those of sons. A daughter could inherit land if there were no sons, and she could inherit movable property such as jewelry, livestock, and household goods. Yet even in inheritance, Viking society revealed its balance between male dominance and practical necessity. Women might not always be first in line, but when needed, the law ensured that they could step forward. Widows, for instance, were entitled to claim their rightful portion of their husband's estate. They might hold property until their sons came of age, ensuring that families did not lose their lands to outsiders. And if there were no sons, daughters could keep estates within the family line, preventing fragmentation or loss of ancestral lands. Think of a quiet Viking farmstead, where a father has passed and his family gathers around the hearth. The sons debate the division of cattle, the daughters consider what jewelry or silver brooches might fall to them, and the widow and